So I want to welcome our guest today. First of all, Mr. Michael D. Simone, a regular guest on our program.
Good to be here.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you.
And also Dr. Scott Winnell, also a regular guest on our program, and glad to have you with us.
It's good to be back.
Very good. Okay. So on Tuesday, just getting our audience sort of up to date with where we are. We've had a lot of different things in the news over the past couple of days in particular, headlining different national, particularly some of the domestic affairs regarding our president. But meanwhile, still in the works is this potential negotiation between North and South Korea. On Tuesday of last week, early this week, North and South Korea removed loudspeakers that were blaring propaganda across the border. Now, according to a Reuters poll, a poll of South Koreans last Friday, the day that the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met South Korean President Moon Jae-in, this poll showed that 64.7% of South Koreans believe that the North will denuclearize and will keep peace. Before the summit, days before, only 14.7% of those polled in South Korea actually believed that there would be peace and denuclearization. So in other words, it seems as if peace is in the air and even hope for peace is in the air. So it seems. So as we get our guests involved here, let me ask you the question. Has President Trump brought peace to the Korean Peninsula?
Well, all we've heard are words, right? We've heard a few words. This all began last Friday with a meeting, so it hasn't even been a week yet. I don't know that we can attribute peace to anything yet. There is no peace. They're words. President Trump, probably not at this point, even though the South Korean president does give him that kind of a credit.
Yes, Small.
Right. I think the answer is, like President Trump has said, we'll see. Time will tell. That's really the answer. I mean, we have to wait to see how it goes. Certainly, it's developed a lot of hope in South Korea, but we'll have to see.
Well, both of you sound like you're on the skeptical side when asked about this question. So surely reflect what is in the minds of most people, probably American citizens anyway. If you look at even some of the quotes from the news, you find things being said like, well, we'll watch and see, we hope, and this type of thing. So why is there cynicism about peace in North Korea? I mean, peace in the Koreas. Why is that cynicism there?
I mean, one thing, at least in our time now, of course, this has not been the first time there's been peace talks there, but one thing is, they just a few months ago, there was some major threats. I mean, the world was on the brink. It was scared that there could be nuclear war. So, I mean, this is quite a change. This is certainly one reason why there's skepticism. I mean, how this immediate change, at least it appears on the surface, what's behind that and so forth. How deep is that?
Yeah, since 1972, this will be the fifth opportunity for these two nations to come together for some kind of a summit to talk about peace. The last one was in 2007. And as Mr. D. Simone mentioned, it was just a couple of months ago that they're at fisticuffs talking about potentially catastrophic fallout if the South goes in and tries to do something in the North. The other thing is, it has to do with trust. Who do you trust? Can you trust individuals who waffle so quickly? And many of the South Koreans actually are asking the same question. They're optimistic, yet at the same time, they don't trust this guy from North Korea, Kim Jong-un, because of his actions in the past.
Go ahead.
That's on the South Korean side, and kind of looking at North Korea and can we trust them and that type of thing. But then there was, of course, New York Times or Washington Post or something kind of points out, okay, well, if we break on the Iran deal, how can they trust us? How can they have trust toward us? So.
Do you think that this microcosm of, let's say, distrust and cynicism that we see with South Korea and North Korea and any sort of détente between the two, does that reflect more broadly on the world? What do you think? I mean, does that attitude more than just applying to South and North Korea?
Oh, absolutely. What was it, 1920, the League of Nations was formed? And then 20 or so years later, a little after World War II, you've got the United Nations that's formed, and most nations in the world are part of this incredible organization that's been developed to bring peace to the world. And where are we in terms of peace in the world today? Thanks to this wonderful organization that's been created. Why the cynicism?
Do you think most people, let's say the average person, man on the street, really has hope that we're going to have true world peace in our time?
I mean, really, that comes down to a very deep, that is a deep-rooted problem. And of course, we've been dealing with it in civilization for, thousands of years, and we have had thousands of years to try to get it right, and we have utterly failed at it for thousands of years.
I was a few years ago, I was able to take a tour of the United Nations building. I don't know if you guys have ever been there, and what struck me the most? I took a tour of the whole facility. The threadbare seats in the General Assembly Hall. They were now I know that's a little. It can sound like a little thing, but it seemed as if it was a symbol of the futility of the organization in terms of actually really bringing peace to the earth. As we were walking, it was in the back of the General Assembly Hall, and I guess they were going to do eventually an overhaul. But actually even the facility is in need of a lot of repairs. It's a lot like our relations between nations, frankly.
Yeah,
So more money than...
Well,
no.
It's interesting, though, because I would argue that a lot of the people involved in the United Nations over the years really are well-meaning.
Sure.
There is a real hope, a desire for peace to come. I think the statistic you showed at the very beginning, where 14% of South Koreans didn't think it could happen, and then after this meeting last Friday, 67% think it can. To me, that speaks to almost the hope beyond hope. People want it, they need it, they desire it so much. Yet it's this elusive thing. People are trying for it the best they can. Every human endeavor that we can come up with is trying to bring peace and seeking peace, but it's futile. And it's shown a track record of futility.
Right. There's a book, Why War? It was some letters that Einstein wrote to Sigmund Freud, and one of the comments he made in one of these comments to Sigmund Freud was talking about, hey, now the ability, or close to the ability, to be able to destroy civilizations. He says this issue has come to mean a matter of life and death for civilization as we know it. Nevertheless, for all the zeal displayed for peace, every attempt at its solution has ended in a lamentable breakdown.
It's the track record. I just wonder, in today's scenario, when we read the scripture that the proverb that says, "Hope deferred makes the heart sick." Every time this type of thing comes up, where there is a hope for peace, when it is dashed, what happens? We become more cynical, and I think that speaks to the cynicism of our world community for true peace. I might mention, by the way, for our viewers, if you do have a question about the topic we're addressing today, please feel free to go ahead and write in, and we'll try to address it as we go. It could be a little disconcerting, maybe a discouraging subject to talk about, but for what it's worth, folks, there are answers, and what we're wrestling with today is, do those answers come from man? Do they come from the mind of man, or somewhere else? So if you have any questions or thoughts to add to the list, please go ahead and jot something down, and our producers will pass it on to me. We'll try to address it as we go through the show. So we've talked a little bit about the cynicism that is there, even in with always a hope, holding out a hope, but still there is that cynicism. Let me ask this then as we go forward. See how our time is going here as we address this. We were going to address all of the areas in the world today where hope is being dashed, Syria and Iran and Iraq, but I think our audience probably gets the point that there's plenty to see that can be discouraging. So back to President Trump then. With all that being said, what is it that has happened at this point in time that has brought the Koreas together? What has President Trump done, or is it anything he's done, or what makes mankind make these decisions to come to a negotiating table? What's happened here?
I think that's an intriguing question, because a lot of times we'll see talk about having peace talks and then kind of moving toward the table. Here we've seen really again, we talked about these major threats that just a few months ago that were being made. He's shooting missiles with nuclear capabilities. I mean, that's a really big deal. Of course, we put sanctions on them. As far as the U.S. has enforced some very serious, powerful sanctions that has only hurt his situation and his people. I saw something that they have spent $100 billion to develop their nuclear weapons and so forth. And of course, that's $100 billion they could have used for their people for whatever different better purposes.
So is the threat of force? Is that what brings peace? Is it, I think the second thing you mentioned, economic pressure? And we use that term economic pressure. What we really mean is starving people to death, don't we? Sadly, for those who are dictators, we really mean starving people to death.
Depends on what he spends his money on.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So is that a valid solution to war and strife, to starve people?
It's interesting. Some of our viewers may know, may not know that the South Korean President Moon Jae-in actually commented last week after this meeting, the shaking of hands across the demilitarized zone, and some of the dialogue that took place, that she was attributing this all to Mr. Trump's actions, and actually claiming that Mr. Trump should receive a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. And there's been a big banter on the web now from these news organizations about this. Is he responsible? I don't think so. Why do we act the way we do as human beings? Why do our national leaders act the way they act as human beings? Isn't it for us? Isn't it for our benefit? Isn't it for self?
For number one, right?
So what you're saying is there's more to it. There is, for the dictator of North Korea, it's a matter of pride or his self, something where he sees something good in it for him. Is that
What's
what you're
in
saying?
it for me?
Okay.
This is an individual, as most of us are, frankly, down to our nature. We don't like to do anything if we don't get something out of it. He's sitting pretty as a leader of a country right now. You look at some of the data on his income and his exploits. The guy apparently has a $600 million a year income, worth about $5 billion US dollars. And I won't go into all the details, but he's okay for himself.
Yeah.
How does he have to maintain his regime? What does he have to do to make that happen? And then there's this ego thing. What can you do to rise higher on the world stage so that you can have some respect from the world?
Which is really what he's wanted. Yeah. That's what he's really wanted, to be respected by the world in a way that they haven't been respected by the world in decades.
So maybe part of it is his desire for credibility and to keep himself in power and those as tools as well. I say this because okay, so we're addressing what are the tools that seem to bring peace in our world. We've talked about a few of them. These are the tools that seem to bring peace. But I would contend that those tools have not worked over the course of history, and they've shown mankind's weakness. What would you say? Would you agree?
They may work on a temporary basis, but really it comes down to the individuals. It comes down to the heart of the individuals. For let's say Kim Jong-un. One article that I had seen, it talked about, hey, if there's been a real change of heart in Kim Jong-un that would lead to real peace between the two Koreas and so forth, then we'll see that in how he treats his people. So we're talking about it is a human nature thing. It is the inside of the person. There's a proverb that talks about, if a man can't rule his own self, or a man that can rule his own self is better than a man that can take a city. So it comes down to, here's a man who's ruling a nation, and if a man can't rule his own self, how can he possibly rule a nation well?
Wasn't it Douglas MacArthur who made the comment at the end of World War II that if we're going to change anything in the world, it has to be of the spirit.
Yeah.
So, something with the spirit has to change. It's interesting, the Bible, people look at the Bible in different ways. Many people in the world talk about it as this book of fairy tales and created by monks and all kinds of things, but it really gives us an interesting commentary on the spirit, on the nature of human beings. And God commented a long time ago in Proverbs 14 that there's a way that seems right to a man, and I think we know the end of it. The end thereof is death. Man has tried, as you say, for thousands of years to do it his way, but he's tried to do it his way. And what happens? Our nature gets in the way all the time.
So let me ask this. So in other words, if we ask the question, why is there no peace? And some would claim, maybe even an audience, some would claim, well, you're not really addressing the real cause of war. It's poverty. It's lack of social justice. It is not having enough food. These are the causes. And what you're saying is actually there are underlying causes that are more at the root of mankind's problem than these are more surface.
Sure. Yeah, mankind has tried to create governments to try and bring peace. And what do you see? Even Plato talked about a cycle of governments, and that you start out from dictatorship and you move your way up to democracy, and then you have anarchy and it starts all over again. The Prussian general and military analyst Karl von Clausewitz, made the comment that politics are the womb in which war develops. Politics. It says politics come from a human form of government and a human design of government. He was making that observation. War comes from that.
And to your question, okay, so why was Albert Einstein, I mentioned, why was he writing to Sigmund Freud? Because Albert Einstein recognized this was a problem of human nature, human nature, and how is it going to be fixed? Why was he writing Sigmund Freud? Because he felt that Sigmund Freud could help with that problem, the problem of human nature.
Now, what you're saying, it goes against the grain in terms of a lot of politicians today, because a lot of politicians, frankly, perhaps a large segment of our society believes that the solution lies with government. For example, we talk about the Arab Spring. If only some of the countries in North Africa would have democracy like us, then they would have peace. That didn't work out very well, did it? So now we're talking about something beyond some, let's say, progressive form of government, democracy. We're saying that's not the solution. You're talking about matters of the heart. Let's actually, before we go further with that, let me invite our audience again. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to jump in there and make a comment or question. We'll try to address it in our discussion the last 10 minutes. Let's come back to the human element, because in terms of the human element, what we're getting to is we can look at problems like the Korean Peninsula, we can look at problems like Syria and North Africa, and we're equating these problems, let's say, to something that lies much deeper in the heart of man. So why don't you go on from that point?
Well, I was just going to say, if we want to look at human governments, in this country, we've had this democracy for a couple of hundred years now. In theory, it should be blossoming, it should be getting better, it should be getting stronger. Sure. But let's look at the data. What is it telling us? We've got murder rates that are skyrocketing in this country right now. We've got all kinds of drug use rates that are exploding in this country. We've got racial tensions that are getting out of control in this country. We've got more and more politicians who are being called on the carpet, if you will, for their indiscretions. What's going on? And these are high-level politicians. What's going on? Something's not working for man.
So democracy is not doing the trick to fix all our problems.
No, and that's this commentary of the Bible that we have that looks into human nature is telling us in Jeremiah that the heart of man is deceitful. and it's desperately wicked. Who can know it?
That's right. Yeah, that was one thing that was sitting in my mind. That's right. James 4 also talks about why are there wars among you, addressing that very issue. Why are there wars among you? It's because because you're looking for your own desires, for your own things, what satisfies me. Number one, putting number one above others. And of course, we do that as a nation, and we feel like there's a need to do that as a nation to some level at least. And it's a difficult line to balance there, but it is at the core. It's how do we treat others?
So can we really truly bring world peace if we base that peace on greed, putting ourselves first? Where does that break down at any point?
Well, what does the Bible say? Everyone does, talking about the end times, what's right in their own eyes. If we don't have a roadmap, a common core of values, a common moral core, then we're going to all come to the table with words. But what are we relying on? And that's why God talks about in the scripture. He says in Leviticus, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments, I will give you peace, which is really a powerful concept. But through what? It's through this common law, this common 10 commandments is what he's talking about, this common way of doing things that we can all get on the same page and use this as our foundation.
There's got to be... what you're saying, just another way to say that maybe is, there's got to be one common standard that the world uses to agree on, to look to, and I've got to, again, from what Einstein had said, and I just find what he talked about very substantial, very meaningful. He says the quest of international security involves the unconditional surrender by every nation in a certain measure of its liberty of action to basically one world government. The only way he thought for peace was for there to be one common standard that all agreed to and all surrendered their sovereignty.
So in other words, we're back to the problem though, is because mankind has to agree.
Sure.
And mankind is thinking of himself first.
Right.
Let me actually bring up a question that came from our audience. And the question is, does the Bible say that God will punish the nations that disobey his law? In other words, is God in the business of punishing North Korea or South Korea or United States, or will God punish nations that don't obey him? How would you answer that? Either one of you want to give it a shot?
I'd say first, God's not a vindictive God. He's not looking to look down from Mount Olympus and just chastise people. He's created this thing called his law that if we break, there are natural consequences. It's sort of like the law of gravity. You break the law of gravity, whether or not you know about it, you're going to find out that you've broken the law of gravity when you hit the floor. And so there's an inherent penalty that's built in for breaking the law of God. If you have killing all over the place, and it's not wrong to kill, you're going to create anarchy in your society, and people are going to hurt and suffer because of that. So that's one piece of it.
He talks about blessings and cursings in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. He talks about blessings for obeying him, for keeping his laws. And I was talking with someone the other day, and the thing came up about about there not being a God, and I mean this. He was saying, I don't believe that there is a God, and we talked about laws and so forth. He says, well, if there was a God, he wouldn't allow for all the suffering. Says, don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Here are all the things that if we did, we would have happy lives. There wouldn't be suffering. The reason there's suffering is because of these laws being disregarded and broken.
God is allowing mankind, at this point in time, God seems to be allowing mankind to learn the lessons from his actions, both on a personal level and a national level.
Sure.
Will God at some point step in?
Thankfully, yes. And Revelation makes that very clear in a number of places. In fact, we're also told that Christ is going to return with a sword in his hand, because mankind's going to need to be their attention's going to need to be gotten. But this is not a vindictive God, again, who's just going to destroy humanity. We go a little bit further into the plan of God after his return. It actually takes us back to the end of the Old Testament in Zechariah, chapter 14, that gives us a vision into what God's kingdom on the earth will be like. And we see a God who actually is not going to let it rain on certain nations, not to cause them to die, but to get their attention and say, listen, if you're not going to obey my commandments, you're not going to keep my holy days, I'm not going to give you rain for a while. I'm going to let you think about this a little bit further. Sort of like a loving parent would intervene with a child.
He's going to teach mankind to actually live in peace, because we don't know.
That's
Yes.
right.
We don't know the way for peace.
He's going to
do we?
work directly with them in that way to help teach them the way of peace.
Yeah.
And one thing I find profound about, what you just mentioned, so he will not allow rain to come on, is what he says in Zechariah, if they don't do what he says, to keep the commandments and so forth. And now he's God, he could take them out of power and put in somebody in power in these nations. Egypt and Assyria is what it talks about in Zechariah there. He could take them out and put somebody in who would do what he says. But ultimately, it will come down to a change of heart on their part, where the leaders and the nations will want to do what he says. Isaiah 2 talks about they'll end up coming up to Jerusalem to learn the laws of God, learn the ways of God.
So peace ultimately is a personal matter, isn't it? Would you say peace is something that is individual? Because let's say in our audience, we can, those who are listening and watching, hey, we can say, I want world peace, and yet the way we treat our neighbor doesn't reflect that. Well, then we're missing the point, aren't we?
Sure.
So I would say we can personally further peace in our own community and our own families by what we say and do. Sure. And until mankind gets that heart, we're not going to. How can we possibly among nations have peace? Sure. There's a comment that was made from one of our listeners saying the statement peace, but there is no peace. Does that apply? Well,
the principle applies. That's taken from Isaiah. And the context of that is the leaders of the Israelite descended nations, basically Western Europe and the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some other nations. It's referring to those nations specifically whose leaders don't bring peace, and they assuage people slightly, it says, by saying there's peace when there actually is no peace. But the principle probably applies much broader to nations all around the world, and I see that too in what's going on in the Koreas. They're saying peace. It might last for a little while, but man's attempts, again, without that change of heart, without the desire to actually help people, love people, take care of people, and get rid of this whole get way of life, this attitude of what's in it for me. No, what can I do as a leader for you so that I can make your life better? Until that happens, this concept of peace is going to remain elusive. It has to.
I want to wrap it up here. We just got about a minute left, but I do want to mention for the sake of our audience that we do have an article in one of our publications that it talks about peace and where peace comes from God, His laws, His ways. And the title of the article is The Way to Peace, the Missing Dimension. So if you get a chance to look that up on our website, I think there's going to be a link that's going to be put up. Click on it and give it a read, because it really talks about this topic we're addressing today in a systematic way. I think you'd enjoy it if you enjoy this topic and if you want world peace. So if you want world peace, read that article, okay? And so if you have no interest in world peace, then fine, then don't read the article. Wow, is that fair?
Pressure.
Is that fair to say? Okay, we've got just a few seconds. So, final comments. Peace. Is this a Korean situation? Will whatever happens today, tomorrow, this next week, will it be really ushering in lasting peace? Is there hope for mankind? Big questions. Give each of you a shot there.
Right. Whether or not there's peace from this, whether or not this works out, the real answer ultimately will be the return of Jesus Christ, who will establish a real, true government that will bring peace.
Yeah, ultimately it's got to come down to, as MacArthur said, it's got to come down to, it's got to be of the spirit. There's got to be a change of heart. There's got to be a change of nature in humanity. And the way of peace is going to be paved with the Ten Commandments. You can't get around that. When you look at those commandments and you imagine what the world will be like if the world just kept one of those commandments, it doesn't take someone who's brilliant or some magnanimous theologian to realize that, wait a second, these principles really are foundational to any lasting peace.
They show love towards fellow man, love towards God, and that's what will create a world that truly is at peace. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you being with us here today. Thank you to our audience for being with us. If you'd like to go ahead and continue to follow our discussions, just make sure that you tune into our channel here, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, and have a good afternoon.